Flippin here with you for FSC Connect, as I say, on Money Week. In for a really interesting discussion about money and you, the second of 3 in the series, all about literacy, insight and advice. We've got a fantastic panel here today. We're joined by Lindsay Francis, who's Marketing Director from the Commission for Financial Capability. We have Andrew Inwood, who is the founder and owner and lead from Core Data in Australia. And we have Ryan Bessemer, who's the CEO of TE Trustees Executors, who are our commercial partners. And so very warm welcome to the whole panel. We are going to just jump into a little bit of the research to start with, just to set the scene so people can see the frame up, and then we're going to get into a really interesting conversation. So, like I say, the research that we've commissioned by Core Data went out to 2,000 New Zealanders, and what we in the FSC wanted to try and understand was all sorts of things about money. How does New Zealand feel about money? What do they do with it? Where do they get advice? Why don't they get advice? How does it make them feel? How much better off are they if they take advice or don't take advice? So I'll just run through the next slide in terms of some of the key highlights and some of the key findings. And the next slide, big thank you to Trustees Executors and a big thank you to Core Data. Money and You won the first edition, kind of showcased the fact that New Zealanders are in pretty poor financial shape. However, there's this underlying optimism that makes them think that they're actually in a better position that they actually are. And some of the questions we asked were, how often do you worry about money? Daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly? And the numbers in the daily, weekly, monthly were noticeably high, alarmingly high. The other question we kind of asked was the link there into well-being and that kind of whole sense of how long could you cope if you were under serious financial stress, i.e. to meet your bills and so on. And that was inside 2 to 3 months under serious financial stress. So that was findings in Series 1. This second edition then went into let's now start to tease out those that get advice with those that don't get advice. And interestingly, hugely interestingly, the numbers are just alarmingly excellent if you get advice based on this data. So people who get advice have 50% more money in their KiwiSaver. They save 3.7% more of their earnings. They get to travel 6 times more frequently than those that don't get advice. If we just keep going to the next slide, this is probably the standout statistic in my mind of the entire series of number 2. And that is for the first time trying to quantify the value of using a financial advisor with an absolute outcome. And the outcome here is that if you use an advisor on a sustainable basis, that you're 4% better off in terms of your investment outcome. And what we've done in the research is actually model that out. So an example in the research is a 25-year-old, someone who's maybe got $16,000 to $17,000 as a starting amount, which is a kind of averaging KiwiSaver, putting around $2,500 a year in for the duration. Advised v non-advised, you can see the number turn up at $1.5 million, and that's huge because I think as a sector, making a really compelling argument as to why you'd want to use an advisor, what the benefits are, I think are both financial as we're evidencing here, but a lot of non-financial questions as well. Finding number 4, we'll come back to that in discussion. Of course, I'm just wanted to give you a bit of a flavour. Finding number 4 were the key questions around triggers for financial advice. And the main ones were all around coming into some kind of money, inheritances and so on. Secondly, around financial distress. So that's around health or divorce, lifestyle change. Third one is around property transactions, buying and selling and so on. And fourth one was around approaching retirement. So kind of really interesting that people tend to seek advice based on a trigger that's happening. And so from a marketing perspective, a product perspective, a discussion perspective, I think it opens the door to the sector to really think about how do we actually tap into that in a more meaningful way. Finding number 5 were this question around the non-financial benefits of money. And so for people who have a sense of control, a sense of goal achievement, a sense of doing what they want to do from an early age and stage with money, understanding the language of money, which I think we probably overcomplicate, really impacts people's well-being. It impacts their health, it impacts their ability to make decisions on all sorts of things, both financial and non-financial. And I think that sleep at night factor, if you will, is huge when we're talking about money. And you can see it turn up in the stress and the mental health data, but you can see it on the flip side with people who are kind of really making calls on where they're heading. We might just head to the next slide briefly. So look, this is just a little bit more evidence. I won't cover it, but we might go on, but this just tells the story. It is in the document. That document is available to everyone, but it does tell the story of how well people who are advised versus non-advised go. And again, you can see in the blue the various case studies that we've had modelled through. Again, I won't cover this now. I think the conversation that we'll have is going to be much more interesting to pursue. And the next slide. And we'll keep going. That's the triggers of advice. And so this is probably the place to end this bit of the conversation. This is the intangible benefits. And you know, when people use words like, it's helped me transform my life, it's helped me achieve my personal goals, it's helped me achieve my financial goals, it helps me, give me peace of mind. These are hugely powerful. And I know we're talking to an audience of sector representatives, and many of us may be in financial advice or get financial advice or advise financial advisors. This is the voice of New Zealanders playing back to us the really important things. And I think there's a lot of value in unpacking some of these things and then figuring out, so where do we go from here? And so if we just go back to the main grid and maybe use that as the starting question, Ryan, I might start with you. Tell us a bit about why TE's got involved, but equally, where do we go from here with this kind of information?
Right, thanks, Richard. TE, as I said last time we spoke, we have a responsibility as a trustee about protecting wealth for everyday Kiwis, and showing the outcomes of this type of research is important to us, to be able to build understanding, of the financial services sector for everyday people, and the importance of going out and seeking financial advice. There's a few surprising parts of this research for me. I think, one of them was the fact that I think between stage 1 of the research to stage 2, there's this thematic that comes out to me, which is around people who are financially literate, people who seek financial advice, have better outcomes. And as you stated before, Richard, in this case, that's 50% more in their KiwiSaver. They save 3.7% more of the earnings, they travel more frequently, etc. And those are some of those sort of tangible points and outcomes that you can see coming out of this type of research. But still, part of that worrying piece is that we also see in the research that only 20% of people are out there getting advice. And who are those people, and how we can encourage other people to go out there and either seek education or advice. So I think there's this, you were talking about this trigger factor before about inheritance or financial stress, and that's not something you need to have to go get advice. Anyone can go get advice. And how do we encourage people to go seek advice? And I think that's what we need to take on as an industry, is how we make that achievable, how we make that affordable, but also the fact that with the financial outcomes, the advice isn't that expensive based on those financial outcomes. So breaking down some of those barriers, I think, is important too. And if you think of getting a financial advisor, it's sort of like going to a gym and getting a personal trainer, someone who's going to help you do better at spending that time in a gym. The same with the financial advisor. You're there, you're doing it yourself. You're the one who's putting the hard yards in and saving the money, but at the same time, they're going to help you maximize that outcome. So Sorry, Richard.
No, that's great, Ryan. I think we're going to come back a little later on because I think you raised some really interesting points. You know, who do you find? Where do you find them? What's the cost? How do you know that they're the right person? There's that kind of whole trust conversation that we've been having in New Zealand around conduct and culture. So I'm just going to park that for a moment. I'm just going to encourage people. This is a webinar of interactivity, people. Feel free to use the chat or the Q&A button. We've already got a number of questions coming through. This is now public information. You can use it in any which way that you wish to. Just attribute it, please. But yeah, the purpose of this is to help inform and start a debate, I guess, in New Zealand. Lindsay, it is, if we can turn to you for a moment, it's Money Week this week, a really important week led by the Commission for Financial Capability. We're all wondering, how's it all going? And tell us a bit about your role, because you're relatively new in the Commission, and what are some of the feedback that's coming through on the wires this week?
Okay, well, couple of points. I've been here a couple of years nearly, and we've just had a bit of a reshuffle at the Commission, and we've been really busy, obviously, through this COVID period, and it really turned our attention really carefully to listening to what people were saying, and that, you know, I think in the whole of this is the key: understand what people need, when they need it, and how they need to receive it. And what we saw, obviously, during COVID was an explosion of questions. Particularly around KiwiSaver, as balances appeared to disappear, to the point we were getting questions like, who stole my KiwiSaver? And, you know, a need for us to respond and reassure people really, really quickly. When it came to planning Money Week for this year, we were really conscious of, you know, sort of suiting the mood of the nation, and you're trying to plan something in advance to suit a situation that you don't really know how it's going to unfold. But what was really common was this consistent need for answers and hunger for information. And really what we've seen is that the subject of money is no longer taboo. People were quite open that they'd lost their jobs. They were quite open that they may be struggling. And equally, we saw that people were starting to save more, and they were starting to turn their attention much more closely to their financial affairs than they had done in the past. Many people whose head was buried in the sand, it was pulled right up, and they started to think about what they were going to do with their money moving forward. And so that's where the theme came from, making it a really safe, reassuring place to answer any questions. No money question is a dumb question. If you've got that question, the likelihood is that someone else has it as well. And so go ahead and ask that question, and we'll be there to answer it for you. We've seen so far, how's it going? Well, we've seen lots of media coverage and lots of people helping us to ask those questions and get those questions out into the public domain. And we've seen lots of people come to Sorted and ask questions specifically. So, you know, you never really know with a campaign like this, you know, will people actually go and ask a question? And they have. So it's just really proven that point that there's this need for information continues. And we're now busy responding to those questions, and they're very varied.
That's great, Lindsay. And interesting what you say, and that's around this link between literacy or knowledge or seeking information as a bit of a starting point. You know, we've had a lot of debate within various FSC committees around, you know, do people just wake up one day and go, I need an advisor? You know, often they just start the conversation around going, I wonder about whatever it is, you know, the trigger events, as we said. And then how do they get on that pipeline and ultimately find the right advisor? Again, we'll pick up some of those thoughts. But Andrew, you've got a huge and long history in researching, that's not a question on your age, apologies for that, but a long history of kind of understanding and tapping into different markets locally and globally around why people get advice, what the benefits are. Tell us a bit about that background and your observations on the Kiwi research.
So for those of you who don't know, Core Data is a small global enterprise. We have operations in New Zealand, Australia, Boston, which covers the East Coast of the USA. It's a small representative office in San Francisco to do the West Coast, the UK, and mainland Europe. So we're doing the same types of research across the world pretty persistently and looking for what's going on. There's some really interesting data out of the Kiwi data. The whole thing that we should be really careful of when thinking about research like this is the problem of causation and correlation. And for those of you who don't know me, you know that that's one of my worst possible jokes, which I'll potentially tell you some other time. But it's really important to understand that this research is dense enough and broad enough to make sure that we're not just covering the people who are likely to get advice. There is a correlation between education and seeking advice, but there is a very clear correlation between getting advice and being wealthier. This is true across the globe. Less true in countries where systems are less complex. So the USA, for example, where their income systems and the taxation systems are less complex, then advice is less meaningful. What it does give you is good behaviors, but more true in countries where taxation and management structures are more complicated. One of the things that we're seeing around the world now, and it's important to understand, is the way in which confidence is starting to move. Confidence has fallen very steeply in Western Europe, very steeply in mainland America, and relatively steeply in Australia. It hasn't really started to shift significantly in New Zealand at the moment. We're not sure of the drivers for that, but it really hasn't started to move yet. All the economic impacts are the same. Well, one of the things is about the Kiwis that we know from many years of doing research there, and I should hesitate to say that I'm born in Papakura and spent a lot of time of my life in New Zealand, is that they're not as flappable as other countries around the world, and they don't oscillate around the confidence measures as much. But what's clear, and what the research proves very transparently, is that the more you focus on storing income and savings behavior, the better off you are in the long term. We're bad at that as humans, and particularly bad at that depending on which part of the world we're from. And there's some excellent research I can bore you with about some other time about that. But the really important thing to understand is that we are very bad about making decisions about our future and very good at making decisions about things that reward us right now. And that's writ large in the research. We just have to learn how to make those decisions which are good for us in the future, not good for us right now.
Andrew, that question around optimism, where you point to globally, COVID is wreaking havoc with people's balance sheets, confidence, outlook, and so on. And yet in New Zealand, we still kind of seem to be sunnily optimistic. Is that because we are living in La La Land, or is the really bad stuff yet to happen?
Oh, the really bad stuff's happened. We call this the Ardern effect. I'm a big fan of Jacinda and the way she communicates, and she's an excellent leader for a crisis. You're in the pre-election phase, so no one's really talking truthfully about the costs which are yet to come in the economy. And there's a lot of information pushing that world. She's a world-class leader, possibly the best in the world, depending on who you ask, and very good at managing those messages. The big concerns about what's going to happen with the New Zealand economy are yet unknown. Effectively, to respond to COVID, the economy has been pushed off a cliff. We don't know yet whether the New Zealand economy is going to be Jackie Chan or it's going to be Humpty Dumpty, but something has to change. Given that two of your three biggest importers of money have effectively been shut down: education, tourism, and retail trade. That money can't come from nowhere, and we have to start to think about how much that effect is going to affect things. Partly it's because New Zealand hasn't had the economic shocks of Western Europe and America, which have been through a lot of economic shocks. Partly because you've got a very good leader, and partly because the nation, as many world wars and other incidences and earthquakes will tell you, is particularly unflappable. And we're yet to see any flap from New Zealand, I guess.
Thanks, Andrew. We'll come back to this question. There's been a couple of really interesting questions come through on the wires. Andrew, I'm going to go to you in a moment, not just right now, just around the demographics and the cross-section of the 2000, which is in the document, so you can have a look at the breakdown. But again, who we looked at. There's a really interesting conversation and question here from Tony around, is one of the inhibitors for consumers getting advice the fact or the sense that they feel they might get sold something? And is that a prohibitor? Ryan, I might just start with you on that conversation, and then Lindsay, I'm kind of interested to head to what's coming through on your wires with the cross section of people. Ryan?
Can you come back to me on that one when you finish, Richard? Because I've got quite a bit of detail about the inhibitors, both locally and internationally.
Well, we'll round out that conversation with you, Andrew. Yep. But to Ryan first.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. You know, I do think that there's still that confidence issue, and as I was saying before, and our step is next step is not only saying what's the value advice, but also you know, what is safe advice, and you know, we hear a lot about what's happened with the Australian Royal Commission and building confidence into the industry in Australia. And I think we need to do the same here, and that is, you know, the separation between advice and product.
Well, we might come back to that one as well, Ryan, because you raise a bunch of obviously really ticklish issues in that regard, and we might, after Andrew talks about his experience, just come back to that. Lindsay, your perspective in terms of what's coming through on the WISE?
Look, I think there's quite a few different reasons, but if you look to the consumer, there can be a number of feelings that get in the way of seeking advice, from shame, fear, worry that they don't have a reason to seek advice, and ultimately that's their own personal confidence. I think what we see is, though, at the same time, when we did some call groups last year around the retirement income policy review that we did, virtually every single person in those groups said, wouldn't it be great if there was a place where you could, you know, if the advisor could come to you and it was free and I could just get this. And so they kind of want it, but they don't really know or feel worthy enough to go for it proactively. And so I guess there's a few barriers there for people. The other barrier, of course, is that they would prefer not to hear the advice because there's much more exciting things to do, which include spending their money on the things that make them feel good in the moment. So, you know, there's those kind of, I guess what's coming in is a lot of emotional thinking. We're not rational human beings, are we? So at the moment, the more kind of emotive we can make the idea of seeking advice, and the more motivating it can feel and linked to the values and the goals of that individual, then the more likely we are to be able to get them over the line and to start to think that that's something that they should do.
Yeah, thanks. Because interestingly, again, the CFSC put out some research just this week, didn't you, around, you know, some millennials are switching off and just going, you know what, I'm going to live for today, play for today, because, you know, it's possible everything will go to hell in a handbasket.
Oh, look, and for that generation, if you think about it, the rug has been pulled right out from underneath them. You know, they're worried about the environment. They're worried about some big things. They don't really know what the future holds for them. And this has just been an extra kick in the kidneys, shall we say.
Yeah.
And, you know, they've been the most impacted with job losses and so on. So, yeah, I think they've displayed quite different behaviour actually to the majority of the population, who we've seen starting to save a little bit more, lift their head up out of the sand a little bit more, and they're just going, oh gosh, let's just go for it. What difference will it make?
Yeah, thanks for that, Andrew.
So there's a couple of things that I want to talk about really quickly here. Unfortunately, I could bore you for hours on this, and there's three clear drivers why people don't seek advice. The first is that they have no ability to assess value. They don't understand how you can assess the value of whether it's good advice or bad advice. The most common story about advice is that someone's been missold something. So while mis-selling exists as the most common story, then assessing value is really, really problematic. So, and that falls into the trust bracket. Unless you can inherit trust from someone else's relationship and you can kind of filter trust through the lens of an existing relationship, then trust is really, really hard to understand it. The third is price. How much do you pay? When you're buying a car or buying a computer, you can assess utility in a couple of simple ways: horsepower, output, safety, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's hard to do in advice because it's complicated. So that's kind of the third thing which is going on there. But the most important thing that we have to get good at this is to explain to people the utility of advice and how it works. And there's a bunch of utilities that we have to be able to talk about. Well, the first one is transformation from chaos into order. That's really important. It takes a lot of work. In the Australian data that we have, there's about 16 hours of advisor time and about 8 hours of paraplanner time and 4 hours of admin time to actually take someone from a chaotic state to an ordered state. And then there's this kind of inferential improvement state. How are you going against an agreed benchmark? An agreed benchmark might be the the New Zealand 50, it might be the MSCI, it might be anything you like, or it might be a sense of feelings. And then there's that kind of recommendation. And then there's a point about anchoring on change, the changes that you've been through, and anchoring on the future. I take your point about Gen X and Gen Y and not deciding not to invest in the future. And there's a relatively good driver for that. Anyone who's doing any economics around the world, and I'm doing quite a lot of that, they're starting to see deflationary indicators pop up all over the place. 40% of the property on the Victorian market has remained unsold for greater than 3 months, which means it's mispriced. If you have no confidence in the future value of your labour, if you have no confidence in the future value of your asset, then there's no reason to store assets in the future because they're simply going to get cheaper. And for the anonymous attendee who asked the question, if Jacinda is such a great communicator, why has she not come out with any clear policies weeks before the election? It's because she's such a great communicator, she's come out with no policies because the policies are going to have to be really tough. She's announced a $300 million spend on employment, which isn't nearly enough to change anything when 30% of your GDP has evaporated. So she's doing what she should be doing. She's getting elected and then making the tough calls.
So just rounding out this part of the conversation, which is trust has to be at the centre, and you can't, trust is what you build, and the research kind of points to how to do that. The other piece is around demonstrating value, that kind of whole piece around utility. And again, within the broader financial services marketplace, we kind of tend to not be that clear around those benefits. We kind of talk about access to product set, but that sense of creating order of your life, achieving the goals, how that makes you feel, and so on. I mean, that's the DNA of good advice, isn't it?
Yeah, so that's the DNA of good advice. And trust is complex, right? So it's benevolence, competence, authenticity, and predictability are the 4 great trust drivers. 200 years of research on that. You can't, so you have to actually experience it, or it has to be transferred from somebody. The second thing is that we don't anchor into the achievement, and we should set up some sensible anchors, like how many months are you safe? Are you 6 months? Have you got, because I tend to run on 3 months cash flow in the business. Given what's going on in the market, late last year, early this year, I pushed that to 6 months because I thought the data was starting to get really choppy. And that's a great conversation for someone to have. And then there's also the conversation about quality of life in retirement. There's another way to frame that. What can you expect if you persist with this? What can you expect in retirement? You can expect to be debt-free. You can expect to travel overseas once a year. You can expect to be able to help your children and be able to have those utility-based conversations. And we tend not to have them. We tend to talk about price, and that's not the right conversation.
But also, you've got to give someone a more immediate payoff than that, because the ability for someone to see that long-term, particularly a young person, is so difficult. So what are the steps? How does it make you feel today? What does that allow you to pay off for today? What's the value proposition in the today or immediate future is something that is often...
That's not advice, that's psychology, and I don't want to get into that with you, but if you took a Jungian framework on that, you can't change people's perspectives through advice because people are hardwired to come with a set of beliefs. And it's an easy way to dismiss the future by saying, I'm not going to play. And that's just the hobgoblin of tiny minds, right? I'm not going to play, so I'm just going to live it off. It's someone else's problem. That's a pretty convenient solution. So people who are correlated towards that have always been correlated towards that. And advice doesn't fulfill that. Advice makes people's futures better. It doesn't make their immediates better.
We're talking about how you get people to be attracted to the idea of advice as well.
Yeah. So again, it's about utility. What is it that it does and how does it do it? And so I take your point, Lindsay. It's complicated, but there's reams and reams of behavioural research about our inability to change the hard dynamic sets of people's concepts about the future. But by bringing benefit forward, which we're hardwired to do, it's a great way to do it. And that you raise an interesting point. I mean, perhaps the panel can solve that. Is there a way to give people an immediate payoff? The sugar hit of getting advice. What can that sugar hit be? I don't know. I've got some suggestions, but I'm not in the market.
That chicken soup you had for lunch has done the trick, Andrew. Thank you. Lindsay, I'm totally going to come back to you just as the way into the conversation. I'm going to plant a seed for Andrew, which Ryan opened the door to, which is does trusted advice need to be independent of a brand? Or is it fair to say that trusted advice can actually live in many different places? trusted brands, independent brands, and so on. But before we head there, just to Lindsay, if I can, you're on mute at the moment, Lindsay. But yeah, there's this question on, it's almost like the runway into the advice conversation, isn't it? You don't automatically go into advice. You might dig around, get knowledgeable, disturb yourself a little, and then go cast around and go, well, who do I talk to? Tell us a bit about the Commission's experience in that.
Look, I mean, you're talking about the behaviour change wheel, aren't you, really, of sort of pre-contemplation, the need before the need, and then there's the sort of the desire to sort of have a look at it and take a look and think about it a little bit, and maybe dabble in it a little bit. And then there's the determination that takes hold when someone decides that this is something that they really want before they move into action. And then you get into the, maintaining that behaviour and continuing. If you fall off that, then you have to start again with that person. So there's also that continuity of contact that becomes quite important, because just like when you diet or use a personal trainer, you sometimes fall off the wagon. And that's true of everybody, because we're not perfect beings. And that's kind of how we tend to approach that and try to understand where people are in that phase. In terms of building contemplation or enabling people to sort of think that this is something that could be for them. Again, it's back to for us, it's back to values and giving people a way into something that relates to them and their hopes, dreams, desires, and where they would like to see themselves.
Well, which is why I thought it's so important, right? Because it's a safe place to just kind of dig around, find some stuff, get a bit educated, talk to someone, and so on.
Yeah, and I know that there's a question here about advertising and whether that works. I can tell you that during COVID, we went back on TV for the first time in 5 years, and we saw our awareness lift by 10 points, and we saw usage lift. Obviously, there was a huge need there as well, but we saw our usage lift by up to 40% a week in terms of what we were seeing as a baseline. That was genuine increase. So I think there is definitely the ability to meet the consumer where they are and give them that motivation and knowledge that there's a place that they can go.
Cool.
That's typical change management practice anyway, to continue to put out a message, but you have to reinforce that message. And I think that's one thing we need to learn, is you're not just saying that once, we need to say it again and again and again and again and again.
Yeah.
So that's shifting the dial question, which is, how do we make the 1 in 5 New Zealanders that get advice? How do we get to the people who are not getting advice, who don't even think they need advice? Is it purely using a serious crisis like COVID to get the word out, or is there something more fundamental, Ryan, that you think we need to do?
I think you use any opportunity available to you, but I honestly do think it comes back down to reinforcement and reinforcement through education with children, reinforcement in the workplace through employers, reinforcement by the government and players in social media. So I think there's not just a one-stop shop here. I think just like understanding mindfulness and mental health and understanding what you need to do for physical health, we need to continue to remind ourselves to look after our financial health, and that's through reinforcement.
Andrew, I'm just going to come back to you for that round-out conversation if I can, and then I just want to jump into the conversation on when the benefits of advice are so clear and now so financially clear. It feels like it's the Coca-Cola formula, and yet we just haven't got the message across widely enough. But Andrew, just back to the first question, can trusted advice live everywhere?
Well, there's a couple of things that are worth talking about. The trusted advice can only expand at the rate in which people can build trusted networks and systems. If I look at the work which is being done in New Zealand, there have been great investments in trusted networks and system. I like Sorted very much. It's a good website. I think it's absolutely world-class. I like the work that a group in New Zealand called Banker, if you don't know those guys, have a look at them, who do primary school education, are doing. But the data from around the world where this has been successful seems to suggest that it's either and take this with a pinch of salt, it's either greed-led and allowing the greedy to become richer very quickly, or it's government-led and compulsion drives it. The ways in which big changes are made inside economies tend to be through compulsion. And if you look at the way that's worked globally, you need to look at Singapore or Taiwan, or even to a certain extent Australia, on post the Campbell report in 1983, to have a look at the way in which governments have played a role in that. In West Germany, it's played by Deutsche Post, and through other organisations in Central Europe, the governments play the same role. Leading people to it slowly is hard because, as Lindsay pointed out, it relies particularly on the deferral of pleasure, and we don't allow the sugar hit of doing it. About 20% of the population are good at deferring pleasure. The other 80% will take the pleasure-seeking activities first. So allowing people to, without exogenous impact like divorce, death, disease, or a large lump sum, to make small decisions about their future, talking about what Ryan was talking about, is a bit like doing the training. It takes time and it requires a great deal of energy. There are all sorts of ways that we could benefit people for taking advice. It could be tax deductible, they could get benefits from it, there could be government stimuluses, which would allow it to move forward, and that would change the dial. Building things like KiwiSaver are important. They can be easy to trust, they can be easy to sort of take on board. But while complexity lives in the system and trust is hard to find, it can only expand at the rate of the trusted network. And that tends to be slow.
And that trusted network, just again to close out Ryan's piece, and I am harping on this a little, can be in brands and independent brands, so affiliated brands or independent brands.
So brands are kind of interesting in their own way, and we do a lot of work on brand behavior around the globe because that's something that people obviously want to invest in. There's a couple of really well-trusted brands around the world. You're all aware of Vanguard and the work that they play because of the way in which they're structured. That's highly trusted. There is a really interesting couple of pieces of research which go around, which look at the trust drivers. And remember, I talked about that before: benevolence, competence, authenticity, and predictability. And people are making the mistake of confusing likability of a brand, which is often reflected in the thing called an NPS score, which is a likability score, and trustworthiness of a brand. And I'll give you an example of that in the Australian example. The Australian's biggest bank is a thing called the Commonwealth Bank. It's the bright yellow one. So that is not a particularly well-liked brand. Its NPS score is relatively low, but it's growing faster than anybody else. And the reason it's growing faster than anybody else is because its authenticity score is very high. It's not trying to pretend to be something that it's not. We've got a bunch of neobanks here, which are all rushing to the market, pretending to be high in service, all about the consumer, all about you, wanting to make only you happy and having lots of smiley, happy people on the networks. But it's not really creating growth because people aren't having a matching experience between their brand experience and what they're being promoted as, so they're not authentic. If you want to read about it or think about it, there's two great books, one by a man called Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who are the fathers of behavioral economics. Kahneman's book Nudge is extremely good, and I noticed that someone has just been talking about that. It's absolutely worth reading. Cialdini's book Influence is just as good and easier to consume. They lay it out in very clear psychological drivers about what actually moves people forward. What's really important to me, and I think there's about 80 people in the finance industry online now, is building, if we can build 80 trusted brands this year, and they can each get to 1,000 clients, that's 80,000 people who will become great advocates for this system. And that's not about performance, it's about trusted behavior. And that's, in any day of the week, an absolutely worthwhile enterprise.
So that's a really interesting place, particularly if you're an advisor or an advice brand owner on this call, and more generally is, it's creating the trusted brand, not necessarily the likable brand to kind of take you places. But it also, on the flip on all of that, and this is around how do you access advice, and number of advisors and so on, for people providing bespoke advice, there's a capacity issue if you want to be able to deliver quality advice to a particular group of people. And once your book is full, your book is full. And that's kind of starting to happen in certain parts around the world, certainly in Australia, Andrew, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a really interesting part around this. And I ask you guys to start to think about your business, because you need to make money from your service. It's not a charity. What you provide isn't a charitable service. It's actually something which is a business. And you sell your time in the way in which anyone else sells your time, and you've got all your input costs. So but you must agree that you can only service a certain number of people. We've been looking at models around the world where people have decided that they can only service a certain number of people to the level that they want to be able to serve them. At a high net worth advice level, they're saying, well, we're tapping out at 400. We can't do more than 400, but we have to charge this much a year from each of our 400 clients to make this economically good for us. And they must agree to that, right? They must agree that we should be in business. If it's mass affluent and where it's kind of a lighter touch, then you can only service X number of people or Y number of people, or before the cost of expanding your business to suit that doesn't work. And the moment that you create a gap between those two things, your clients soon recognize it and start to think about what that means. So you need to build systems which are scalable and replicable to allow you to do that, and get the right partners to make that system work, and find systems to be able to reach people en masse, and to be able to tailor the message as much as you can to allow people to feel the sort of the inclusiveness and the skill that you bring. So that scale thing is a critical question.
So let's round out this conversation, because we've only really scratched the surface. But I think having a good read of the research, again, particularly whoever's watching this, in terms of the calls you make, I think is really relevant. Ryan, I'm going to go to you for a closing comment. When you look at the numbers of getting an outperformance of 4% per annum, which is transformational, where are we? Yeah, well, I mean, what's your observation? What's the silver bullet? What do we have to do as a sector to really shift that dial?
Once again, I think it's about the availability to advice, and I understand where Andrew's coming from, but I think advice doesn't have to be holistic all the time, and you can get limited advice for limited functions. And I think you need to start with something like KiwiSaver, and go out there and seek advice for your KiwiSaver to start with. It's not going to be that expensive. It is, like I said, it's not holistic. It's for a specific purpose. But once, particularly with that 4%, in KiwiSaver, and what that means in KiwiSaver over a period of time, that's a great place to start to get inexpensive advice on one part of your financial life, and start from there.
Thank you, Ryan. Lindsay, your take on this part of the conversation.
I think it's interesting the way that you've positioned that, Ryan, because I think one of the things that tends to happen in this space is it becomes really complicated really quickly for people, and their ability to digest and take on the vast amount of things that they should do differently becomes overwhelming. So it's kind of the how do you eat an elephant type of scenario, break it down into some nice small digestible chunks of activity and actions that people can do. Maybe that is the sugar rush, because if you achieve one thing and you can tick that off your list, then you might feel empowered and ready to take on the next thing.
I think the numbers are there in this research, and just on KiwiSaver alone. And
Lindsay's right, though. It's that confluence of positive reinforcements which drives human behaviour. It's a very important factor.
So, folks, let's round out this conversation. We promised we'd be out by just after 4:15, and it's just after 4:15, by saying a couple of things. A huge thank you to the panel. Really insightful. I think the demand on our various webinars on this, and certainly from the media, there is a thirst for this kind of conversation in a way that's really accessible to New Zealanders, to help them make and take the first step, has been my observations. The role of financial advisor is critical in this. Obviously, all of the FSC changes and so on are going to kind of drive some of that discussion around, who do you take, who do you see and who do you work with, and how do you get good quality, trusted advice and so on. And I think the regulatory drive on that is partly that. So on behalf of all of us here, thank you to the fabulous comments that are coming in. Thank you to Ryan, Thank you to TE. Lindsay, thank you to you and the CFSC. Money Week continues for the rest of the week, so look out on their website. And Andrew, as ever, to Core Data, who have helped us drive this conversation, a big thank you. Everyone out there, this is live. It will go up on the system, so you can watch again if you really want to, but certainly take some of the notes, and really good provocative conversation. So thanks all, and have an awesome afternoon. Bye for now.